So, Fernando, based on what you just told me, I have several questions, but I'd like to leave them for the end of the show because they're too much to wrap up right now. And really, what I'm interested in talking about now is what are the main lies or fallacies that Spanish society or young Spaniards have accepted through the educational system about the terrible civil conflict that the war meant?
Well, just mentioning them would take a very long time. I mean, first of all, that there's a very healthy reaction against the imposition of a certain version, because here it's about comparing versions. And probably, no, surely there are different points of view, and supporting one or another is something legitimate. What is not legitimate is imposition, even less so with an official character, as intended by the historical memory law and democratic memory law. Imposing an official narrative that cannot be disagreed with, where there are even fines and seizure of materials that present a different discourse, like books or other types of media. This is what is intolerable. And of course, these kinds of measures are taken because, in reality, the imposition of the official narrative cannot withstand an alternative narrative, a different explanation. From the causes of the war, for example, answering what you were asking me about the very causes of the war, about why the Spanish Civil War broke out, the background of the Spanish Civil War, it's very interesting to see how the democratic memory law and the current one don't investigate anything before July 18th, 1936. We have a still image from the 1936 coup d'etat uprising, and they're not interested in why it happened. And they're not interested in what happened before, what happened earlier. Why? Because logically that picture needs to be explained. Why did those events happen? Why is it that in half of Spain, as Gil Robles said, half the country, half the nation refuses to resign itself to die and rises up in a certain situation? From there, during the Civil War, there are countless myths. For example, the myth that the nationalists were fascists. Let's take, for example, the myth that the nationalists prevailed thanks to international help. The myth that the nationalists were more powerful than their enemies, the rebels, or whatever you want to call them. And then there are a number of specific myths that persist that are still there. For example, the myth of the bombing of Guernica comes to mind, the international brigades, the very outcome of the war, why the war ended with the victory of some and the defeat of others. The truth is that there are a huge number of myths about the Civil War, and that's precisely why questioning all those kinds of things must be forbidden. Repression is also one of the great myths that needs to be clarified a lot about the Civil War. The genocide during the Civil War against the Catholic Church is something people avoid discussing or mention as little as possible. Naturally, because it reverses the terms of good and bad in a lot of ways. Countless myths surround the Spanish Civil War.
I would especially like to break down several of them, but since we can't cover them all because we have limited time, unfortunately, what interests me most is what's most important to me, because this is where the genesis lies. And in the genesis, if you really analyze the causes, that's where you can decide why this breaks out. And that's where I think more indoctrination may occur. And I do this not to impose a vision, neither Fernando Paz's vision, nor Jay Valenilla's vision, but so that people have an alternative opinion. I already told you outside, I left the Institute thinking one thing. My time in Panama made me reflect on the ideas instilled in me by the educational system. And as a result of starting to question everything, I started watching alternative documentaries. I watched several documentaries and realized things weren't as I'd been told. Most impactful for me was the discussion of the causes, since it hadn't been addressed before. Why didn't anyone tell me about the Second Republic? Why did the war start? Fernando.
Well, there are different types of causes. There are some underlying causes. There are things to consider and analyze. And the thing is, in Spain at that time, there had been a very uneven development. Spain was a considerably backward country if we compare it with European countries, what we would call today the countries around us, and a country where there was great social injustice. There was, above all, in the southern half of Spain. It had been created 100 years earlier. Since the disentailment of 1836, it had been created. There was a situation of enormous injustice, according to which there were very few landowners. Most were rentiers due to the way disentailment was done, not working the land themselves, and there was also a sizable urban proletariat. rural proletariat, we can call it that, right? In many areas of Andalusia, but also in La Mancha and Extremadura. It was common in the villages. Dozens and dozens of men in the central square of the village who literally barely had enough to eat. And going to the landowners early in the morning to choose who would work that day, right? And you all come to my land to work it. They worked from sunrise to sunset, often just for a plate of gazpacho and a peseta. Even this couldn't support their families. The situation was in many cases tragic in much of Spain. Subtitles by the ESOS. These objective facts affected the Civil War. The agrarian problem was certainly a very important issue. There was also a significant imbalance in industrial development. There were some regions in Spain, mainly Catalonia because of its importance, Vizcaya, Madrid and Asturias, where, as I said, that industrial development had taken place. Also quite uneven, which, moreover, had inherited certain situations from the 19th century that were considerably unjust. Also, between 1868 and 1870, the subsoil's disentailment put national wealth into the hands of foreign exploiters. They weren't even asked to set up processing industries in Spain so that the exploitation of the subsoil could provide jobs. Instead, what was extracted was used to clean up the treasury and to finance wars, especially the Carlist War. In short, as I said, it was a situation of great imbalance and a lot of social inequality. And that wasn't fixed, it wasn't resolved until the changes that mainly took place during the 1950s and then the 60s and 70s in Franco's Spain, which is the Spain of modernization. These are underlying causes, they are very important causes. There is also what was seen as the religious problem, the process of secularization in Spain, which happened in a certain way, especially in its later stages.
Very aggressive.
Against the church and against, well, the fact that Spanish society was overwhelmingly Catholic. Nationalisms also arise. There is a territorial problem that is mainly promoted by the bourgeoisie. These are local conservative interests.
Are you referring to Catalan and Basque regionalisms? Basically, nationalisms.
Catalan and Basque. The Basque is somewhat of a disciple, in a way, of the Catalan Sabino Arana. In fact, he was in Barcelona learning how all of that was developing. And they were mainly defending, as I said, bourgeois interests, interests of the upper class, people with money, people who owned industries and so on. Well, all of that gives us a picture of tension in Spain. Added to the fact that in Spain, what had happened in other parts of Europe had not taken place. An industrial revolution worthy of that name reasonably spread throughout the national territory. And a kind of, if we want to call it that, refounding of the nation, which had happened in other parts of Europe but had not happened in Spain. In Spain, the nation is not refounded. In a liberal and industrial sense, to put it one way, it creates a large bourgeoisie and a large middle class, which leads to enormous class tensions, so to speak. All that situation, which is partly mitigated during the Restoration period, especially the second part of the Restoration, with some attempts basically from the right by Mauro, who wanted to carry out what he called the revolution from above. Mauro was a very modernizing conservative leader in Spain who had observed what was happening in Europe and had said, either we make the revolution or they make it for us. But Spain couldn't continue this way. He aimed to create a middle-class country, but it wasn't possible for many reasons. But that situation of deep injustice, instead of being addressed by, let's say, progressive governments or by governments that understood that only through modernization could that system of things be ended, it was taken advantage of by the left to create an environment, an atmosphere, a ground, a fertile soil for revolution. And in fact, when the left governs during the Second Republic, none of the major problems facing Spain are truly addressed. And on the other hand, those problems are used as a lever for social agitation to achieve a series of political and ideological goals, which are revolutionary goals. And those are, I would say, fundamentally the underlying causes of the outbreak of the Civil War. Then there are more immediate causes that were, if you want to put it that way, more urgent, precisely because of their condition, because of their nature. And following up on what I mentioned before, the left has been around since before, and I think it's worth explaining this. since basically 1933, when the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party shifted its ideological goals, but especially from the Asturias Revolution of 1934. The Spanish left is undergoing a rapid revolution. No longer does 90% of the Spanish left, except for a few moderate Republican sectors, which are very few, want it. Most of the Spanish left. Socialism, anarchism, and communism in their different forms, because they are truly very protean, very changeable. There are many organizations.
And belligerent with each other, right?
That is one of the causes of the defeat in the war, a fundamental cause of the defeat in the war of the Republicans. But starting from October 34, the project is frankly revolutionary. To that, you have to add that the socialists and the anarchists don't have a clear idea of what they want to do. They don't really have a plan. They don't know what or how to do it. Only the Communist Party truly has an idea of the strategy and tactics of how to bring the situation to, let's say, a revolutionary goal. The rest, what we find, is a constant aggressive, violent agitation without any immediate purpose, which exasperates Spanish society and fundamentally the most disadvantaged sectors of Spanish society. They are brought to situations of enormous tension that are never fully resolved. The left in charge of the government in Spain, and of course the right, also do not solve any of the problems they are facing during the Second Republic. Instead, they make them worse. And that, added to the events of February 36, when the Popular Front won the elections in an absolutely fraudulent way. That has been proven. Yes, this. About 10 years ago, approximately, a book called 1936 was published. Is it called Fraud and Violence? I think that's the name. It does an absolutely exhaustive study of the records of the Second Republic and estimates that electoral fraud was widespread. And therefore, the Popular Front's victory in February 36 was not democratically legitimate in any way. In other words, they didn't really win the elections. It should also be said that back then, this kind of, let's call it formal democratic fundamentalism didn't exist, according to which, let's say, democracy is the thermometer for everything, or the measure by which everything is judged. But back then, that really mattered more or less very little. Everyone knew that there was going to be a collision between those two Spains. In fact, the Civil War breaks out because there was already a division among Spaniards. It's not the cause of the division, it's the consequence of the division among Spaniards. If we look at what we can call coups d'etat, or military uprisings in the 20th century, we basically have three. Many try but fail. Only three stand out for their depth, significance, and importance. In September 1923, Primo de Rivera, Captain General of Catalonia, led an uprising in Barcelona, who stages a coup d'etat. The one on February 23, 1981, didn't lead to civil war. Only the 1936 coup d'etat resulted in civil war. Why? On the 23rd, Primo de Rivera had support from nearly all of Spanish society except anarcho-syndicalist groups, mainly in Catalonia. And therefore, no one rises up against Primo de Rivera. He stages the coup, the king approves it, and that's it. He governed for 6.5 years. The February 23, 1981 event is a very interesting topic. It's a self-coup, a regime coup against itself led by the monarchy to legitimize its rule. It's a coup, indeed. It's a coup by the monarchy, it's a coup by the political class, and it's a coup by the journalistic class. It's really a self-coup. But where is the military used as it was during all the 19th century uprisings? It's not a military coup, but rather one by the intelligence services, by the CSID, or the National Intelligence Center as we'd call it today. February 23rd is a fascinating topic. What's important is that neither Primo de Rivera's coup nor the one on February 23rd resulted in a civil war. Why? Because in one case, everyone supports Primo de Rivera's coup. To be clear, the vast majority. And in the case of February 23rd, because no one, once it failed, above all, no one supports the coup of February 23rd. So there is no division in society and a civil war does not occur. The one on July 18th, 1936 does cause a civil war. It causes a civil war because Spanish society was already divided beforehand. It's like a response, a consequence of that division. Yes, in a way, it is a consequence of that division.